Hello, I'm Dr. Pierre Simon, and it's wonderful being back with you. Today we're continuing to talk about suicide and a new look at suicide with some of the theories, but this particular theory we've been talking about came out in 2005, and there's been follow-up to it ever since, but I never really paid a lot of attention to this particular theory earlier, and as I was doing research myself, I came across it, and I thought this makes a lot more sense and helps us to understand this dilemma that occurs when people have suicide thoughts or act on those suicide thoughts. But I'd like to warn you ahead of time that this material contains some graphic content, and if you feel that's going to be uncomfortable for you, please skip on to another series that I might be doing or one that I've already done. You don't have to watch something like this if it's too uncomfortable. However, I'm sure just about everyone out there has met someone who has attempted suicide, or has a family member or a friend who has attempted suicide, or knows of one who unfortunately completed a suicide. And it leaves questions in our minds when that happens, because many of us think, well, something I would never think of, something I would never do. And yet, everyone has the potential for suicide. It doesn't matter what personality you have or what temperaments you have. If circumstances are right, the potential is there. And it helps us to recognize and understand more about it, not only so that we can put pieces of the puzzle together regarding people we've known who have attempted or completed suicides, but putting the pieces of the puzzle together for ourselves when maybe there were thoughts at times of, well, why don't I do this? What if this happens? Or, oh, you know. And we're not talking about, oh, I'm ready to go, Lord. Take me up. That's not suicide. Suicide is an intentional inflicting of, let's call it murder, self-murder, lethality of oneself. So keep it in mind that this can be a little uncomfortable as we talk about this. This is the interpersonal theory of suicide that we have been covering in the last 3 parts. This is part number 4 that we are discussing today. According to the interpersonal theory of suicide, the most dangerous form of suicidal desire and behavior is caused by a coexisting presence, so not just one element, but several elements working together. And so when those elements are present, there's a higher likelihood of serious suicidal ideations or thoughts and acting on it, whether it's successful or not. I shouldn't even use that word successful, whether that person completes it or not. So there's 3 interpersonal elements based on this theory that's been identified. One of those elements is thwarted belongingness, and we spoke of that last time. The next one is perceived burdensomeness. So, those words kind of explain what they mean. You don't feel like you belong. That doesn't feel good. You feel like a burden. That doesn't feel good. And then the third is acquired capability. And we'll talk about that next time. But today we're talking about perceived burdensomeness. A belief of hopelessness as an example, this'll never end or never change, is also important to mention, because hopelessness has to be there, whether with perceived burdensomeness, with thwarted belongingness. Hopelessness is a factor in those, and in the third element as well. So the hopelessness is an emotion that, well, you feel helpless, and that generally that helplessness, if it's present, it magnifies those other things. Perceived burdensomeness is the belief that one's existence is a burden. It's not understood, but a burden to who? You might be in the workplace, you feel like a burden because you're not keeping up. Well, that's typical, or it happens. You might be at school and you feel like a burden to the teacher because she's always having to help you or answer your questions. Yeah, okay. But it's that sense of belief that one's existence is a burden on family members, friends, and society. It's not just one place usually, although one place can be magnified to a point of thinking you're better off not there, or they're better off without you, particularly when it comes to family. Burdensomeness comprises two dimensions in interpersonal functioning. So interpersonal functioning with others in relationship or just in superficial encounters, beliefs that the self is so flawed, that I am so flawed that I'm a liability. I make things worse for the people in my life. Not a comfortable thought to have, but when that belief is there, it's like a heaviness. It weighs you down. It's an emotion-driven way of thinking, but also self-hatred is there. With self-hatred and with being flawed, it's a heavy load to carry. I hate myself. I'm useless. That's self-hatred. All of us have had those thoughts once in a while. If I eat too much, I hate myself. Yeah. But this is where it's chronic. This is where it's obsessive. This is where that thought just keeps hammering that person, not just because they ate too much or went to the buffet line and picked the dessert when they shouldn't have, as I do once in a while. Two parts of perceived burdensomeness are, they're important to recognize. The self-hate that I just mentioned, I hate myself, and the feelings of liability that I was talking about. My death is worth more than my life. When you begin to think that way, your self-image begins to shrink. You begin to see yourself as nothing, worthless, valueless. And we're going to talk about some of those characteristics in a little bit. When that occurs, it can be at home, it can be at work, it can be any place. So here are some examples that you see on the screen of emotional states of mind in which risk factors significantly contribute to the perceptions of being a burden to others. The obvious one, unemployment. I hear that more than anything else. When someone loses that job, whether it's a career position or just an intermediate position, if that's their sole sense of identity, if that's their sole financial means of paying their bills and there's not enough money in the bank, they lose that job, that's devastating. And it impacts everyone to a great extent. Medical or health problems, incarceration, oftentimes that adjustment for those who are sent to prison is just too much to handle. Financial loss, not just losing some money, but all their money. Perhaps they've invested a great deal in the stock market and the stock market crashes and all of their hard work is gone. And they can't recapture it. They can't bring it back. Well, that can be very devastating for those that have focused so much in that area of their life. Homelessness. Some people, I'm amazed at some people how they adjust so well to homelessness. I've spoken with some people who, it's like water rolling off their back. It's just, they're adjusting. It's not most people, but it's amazing how some do adjust to that. Most, that depression, the downward feelings, the negative thoughts and feelings just sink deeper and deeper as each week, each month, each year goes by. I recall a lady that I met by chance in the parking lot back in Daytona Beach where my office was, and she was sitting by the wall, and she had different things around her, her possessions, and I thought I would say hi and talk to her a little bit, and it was interesting how she was a matter of fact about it. Oh yes, I come down every year. I pass through here on my way to Miami, South Florida area where it's warmer, and she has a routine. And I asked her, about her routine, and she had been doing this for, it was 10 or 15 years, if I remember correctly. But she was telling me how it's getting harder, it's getting more difficult, and it's weighing her down so much. And I, went to the store and got her some groceries and some gallons of water. It breaks your heart when you see people like that. But she's a survivor. She didn't commit suicide. She hung in there and continued to go forward in her lifestyle. Low self-esteem is another one that is an example of emotional state of mind that can bring someone down into having that perception of being a burden. Unwanted, feeling unwanted, which connects with shame. Feeling victimized. Some people are victimized once and they never come back from it. It's just too devastating for them. Some people are victimized several times, multiple times. They bounce back. Depends on the character, depends on their personalities, it depends on their temperaments, depends on their background, their upbringing, their interaction with the world around them during childhood and so on. So many factors play into all this. Temperament's important because certain temperaments, well, you're just not going to see suicide that much in certain temperaments. For example, a sanguine temperament, extrovert of high intensity, that's something they're not going to think about. They're going to keep going forward. Something really bad would have to happen for them to even follow through with an attempted suicide, because they love life. And if things are down, oh well, we'll make it better, or oh well, I'm not getting along, I'll go find somebody else that I can get along with. They kind of bounce back more easily. Melancholies, no, they don't bounce back as easily. They're deeper thinkers, they're more serious-minded. And so when bad times happen, difficulties are there and are persisting, then they're prone to thinking more about morbid thoughts, negative thoughts, than the sanguine would be. And then you have the other temperaments, the choleric, which is the performance-based individual, the leader. He or she is going to take charge and run with things and accomplish things. They're very goal-oriented, but they're not going to tell you if they're going to commit suicide. Cholerics don't have to tell you. They already know what they want to do, and they do it. And oftentimes those that give no warnings, when you look into their background, you discover they have that choleric temperament somewhere in there, either in social or control or in affection. Then the phlegmatic, the middle-of-the-road person, independent but indifferent. It's a good example of phlegmatic. They can be either or. They can be social or not. And they sometimes have that inner conflict, but basically they continue to go forward because they're problem solvers, they're thinkers, and they get along with just about anybody, even very difficult people. Then the supine temperament, which was identified back in 1989, I believe, or around that time period, by the National Christian Counselors Association. Dr. Richard Arno and his wife Phyllis, Dr. Phyllis Arno, spun off that temperament from the passive sanguine, what used to be called the passive sanguine. And that supine temperament's laid back, a thinker, just like the melancholy is a deep thinker, supine's a deep thinker, and they bounce back a little faster than the melancholy does, and they can be social or they can be introverted, but they need that time for de-stressing. So suicide thoughts, suicide ideations, or completed suicides, yes, you're going to see not as much as you might with the melancholy, but you might see a higher an increase in the supine temperament. So temperaments make a difference. Follow-up studies on perceived burdensomeness have been going on for a while, and it's been interesting what they found. Perceived burdensomeness was found to predict suicide ideation and suicide risk across many areas. Hospitals, mental health clinics, primary care, schools, community outreaches, community programs, community activities, and online populations. They've been able to identify who has suicide potential just with looking at perceived burdensomeness. So we want to look at that. You want to pay attention to that. If you start hearing those comments from your child, your teenager, your friend, your family member, or even your own thoughts, you start hearing those comments that they're a burden. Pay attention, because suicide thoughts are often, well, we could say suicide thoughts often go hand in hand with thoughts of perceived burdensomeness. According to the theory, thwarted belongingness that we spoke of last week or last time and perceived burdensomeness together constitute the desire for suicide. Deception is when perception is wrong. And oftentimes when we perceive things, we're wrong until we get the facts, until the truth is exposed, or until we learn more, understand more about whatever it is we're perceiving. There's a higher likelihood we're going to be wrong. So perceived burdensomeness is a lie most of the time. It's a deception. And if we start believing the lies over and over again, we fall into denial or delusion. And that's when we start thinking bad things, negative things, wrong things. It's not necessary. It doesn't have to be that way. We're going to talk about this theory some more next time, but what I'd like you to do in the meantime is read up a little more about suicide, especially if the family member and someone you know you may be concerned over, because many times just being a friend, just being a listener, just offering a helping hand lifts someone out of that deep gully of negative thinking, suicidal thinking. And it can mean everything in the world to that person. So be considering that. And so next time we're going to get into the third part of interpersonal theory on suicide, which is acquired capability. And I hope you will join us for that. God bless.